concerned about status. God is not concerned about how powerful we can be, how high we can stand in society. God is concerned about humility, about a willingness to serve and a willingness to trust rather than a readiness to dominate others. And this, it seems, was a lesson that the disciples wrestled with. You can see the question here in chapter 18 and verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And then you go over to chapter 20 and reading from verse 20, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, in other words, two of the disciples, the mother of two of the disciples came up to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." She wanted a position of privilege for her two sons. Then you drop down to verse 24. When the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus called them and said to him, sorry, I'm having trouble with my vision. And said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." And that takes place just before Jesus enters Jerusalem for the final week leading up to his crucifixion. And then later that week, there's the final supper, after which Jesus is going to be arrested. And even at that time, according to John in chapter 13, Jesus kneels down, washes the disciples' feet. And what's that about? Again, it's about humility and service. So this was a recurring issue with the disciples. And Jesus says here to them, you need to become like children. But that still leaves us with the question of who exactly is Jesus referring to when he talks here several times about the little ones. Is he talking about actual children, or is he talking about Christians? Well, one writer simply said, why not both? Excuse me, I've got a dose of painkillers this morning. Obviously, there's a child there. And Jesus says in verse 5, for instance, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But also here, he has talked about his followers being like children. And if you look at the context, this discussion goes on to Jesus talking about dealing with your brother when he sins against you in verses 15 and following, and dealing with the question of forgiveness in verses 21 and following. So why can't Jesus, when he talks about these little ones, be talking about both actual children, showing care for the children, and also showing care for Christians, particularly humble Christians who have put their trust in Jesus and who are striving to learn and to grow and to serve? So the point is, don't be too proud to care for children, and don't be too proud to care for your fellow Christians. So let's look then at the 3 points that are raised here in regard to the little ones. Number 1, in verses 5 and 6, do not corrupt the little ones. Jesus first says in verse 5, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. This is the idea that when you relate to a child, then bring a spiritual element into it. We should be caring about children, not merely physically or whatever, but also spiritually. And we should be reaching out to them and trying to nurture them and help them to develop in regard to God and Jesus Christ and salvation. You look at Matthew 19 verse 13, you've got the opposite sort of thing here to receiving children. Matthew 19 and verse 13, then children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. See, Jesus himself there saying that in regard to children, make time for the children. Don't consider them to be a nuisance, an annoyance or whatever. Make time for them. But as I said, you can also, in this idea of the little ones, see Jesus speaking of Christians, particularly perhaps younger Christians, younger in the faith, and saying, don't corrupt them either. Receive them rather than driving them away. If you think of, well, let's go on with the next verse, verse 6. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. So you're talking about people who are old enough to sin. We're talking about how we impact upon them. Again, we can think of both aspects of this. Our impact upon children, particularly if we're parents. Might we be leading our children into sin? It did happen. You can go back to 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 3. And you're reading here about one of the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah, namely Ahaziah. He reigned somewhere around 841 BC. He reigned for only a year. He was evil. It says in 22 and verse 3, he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. She had her own background, her own inclinations, you might say, and she influenced her son in the negative way. Now, we might not set out to do that, to cause our children to be evil, but it may be that we provide such an inadequate example and show such little concern for spiritual matters that we certainly don't lead them in the right paths. So it's something to be mindful of. The influence that we're having on as parents upon our children and as Christians upon fellow Christians. Because sometimes older Christians may be setting an example that leads other Christians in the congregation astray. I think of a passage that I referred to last week, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. And Paul says there, do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? In other words, a little bit of yeast works its way through the whole mixture. And a more common way of putting that today is one bad apple spoils the bunch. You've got one bad apple, and what happens? Well, if you don't take that apple out, the others are going to go rotten. And you might think of vegetables in a vegetable store or perhaps in your fridge. We have an impact. We're not island. And therefore we need to strongly consider how we're affecting others. Jesus says in verse 7, "Woe to the world for temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes." That if we are misleading others, if we are corrupting others by what we say, by what we do, then God says, woe to you. In fact, going back into verse 6, you'd be better off putting a heavy millstone around your neck, being cast into the sea. A millstone consisted of two circular stones, one of which could be turned on top of the other, and you would feed grain in, and that would grind the grain and produce flour. Now, in some cases, the stones were of a size where an individual, and it was usually the women that did that sort of work, so they could handle that themselves. But with heavier millstones, you needed an animal to turn that. Well, you put a millstone like that around your neck and jump into the sea, you ain't going to survive. And what it's saying is God holds us accountable. So don't corrupt the children. Don't corrupt your fellow Christians by your influence. So we have a responsibility to them. We then go on into, well, something else for us to consider here. If we're not to have a negative influence, then we've got to look at ourselves and our nature. Jesus says in verse 8, "If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire." Is that literal? I remember an old black and white movie, probably from the 1950s and the 1960s, where a man loses a hand and he's given a transplanted hand. But it turns out the hand that is transplanted is the hand of a murderer, I think it was. So this hand has a life of its own and is evil. And I think the movie closes, and I'm thinking back a long way, I think the movie closes with this man hacking off his own hand, that transplanted hand, because it was evil. Are we to do something like that? I don't think so. Is 1 foot more inclined to evil than another? Is 1 hand more inclined to evil than another? Is 1 eye more inclined to evil? No, evil generates in our mind. But the point here is that we need to take a good look at ourselves and be willing to take whatever steps are necessary to overcome sin in our lives. And if there is a weakness in our lives, if there are things that, temptations that do get to us, then we need to make a point of dealing with that for our own sake and also for the sake of those around us, our children and fellow Christians and so forth. So, number 1, don't corrupt the little ones. Don't be a corruptive influence on those who are near you. And then we go on into verse 10. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. The word despise here translates a Greek word meaning to think against, to think little or nothing of, to think down upon or against anyone. Hence signifies to think slightly of. So if I despise somebody, I regard them with contempt, I look down my nose at them, I think they are worth nothing. Jesus says, do not despise one of these little ones. Why? Because their angels see the face of my Father who is in heaven. And this leads some to the idea of guardian angels. They say that each child has a guardian angel. Well, that's not an idea that is developed in Scripture. And to me, it hardly seems that that's the way it is when I think of the many children who suffer, the many children who die. The idea of guardian angels doesn't compute in my head. If they're guardian angels, then it doesn't seem like they're being very successful. But remember what I've said thus far, that when you look at the context, when you look at the fact that Jesus is calling his followers to be like little children, then the idea becomes that we're not simply talking here of angels for children, but we're talking about angels working for the sake of God's people. And that is certainly scriptural, because there's reference to it over in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. The writer here is talking about the superiority of Christ, and he talks about the superiority of Jesus over angels. Hebrews 1 verse 13, to which of the angels has he, God, ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? What are angels? They are ministering spirits and acting for the benefit of God's people. So the point here is that if angels are acting for the benefit of God's people, then don't you despise God's people. Don't look down upon them. Treat them well. Treat them with high regard. Can we despise others? I think so at times. In the church sometimes we regard children as a nuisance, an annoyance, they're noisy, whatever. Why don't they go and play outside? Sometimes we ignore children, and I've watched in congregations sometimes where children are trying to get the attention of their parents, but the parents are busy talking to one another. They don't want to be bothered by their children. I remember in one congregation where Lavinia and I were, that two children were left to run wild during the worship service, running around the room, running outside the building, which was all glass, and making loud noises. And the parents said, well, look, we want to focus on worship. So they ignored their children, and the rest of the congregation suffered because of that. Don't despise children that way. None of us should treat them with contempt. Why? Because they're human beings who grow up to face God. We need to think about their salvation, and we can either influence them towards God or away from God. The same in the way that we treat fellow Christians. Sometimes in the church we have cliques, we have groups that stick together, and we don't let others into that group. We gossip about others and so forth. Look, we need to make time for other people. We need to show that we care. Some versions, including the one that Brian read from, have Matthew 18 and verse 11, which says, for the Son of Man is come to save that which is lost. So versions like the King James Version and the New King James Version, which include that verse 11, are saying that's another reason why we should not despise the little ones, because Jesus is concerned about the lost. And that's quite scriptural. However, textually speaking, that verse doesn't seem to belong there, and so you'll find some of your Bible versions do not include it. Is that passage unscriptural? No, it's not. It's actually from Luke chapter 19 and verse 10. but it appears that somewhere along the line in some manuscripts, scribes transposed that passage into this verse because they thought that it would be relevant to what Jesus is talking about. So if you look at Luke 19 verse 10, it indicates there that the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost. And it says that in regard to Zacchaeus, a man looked down on by society, but Jesus is saying, I care about all people. So don't despise little ones. And then in Matthew 18 verses 12 to 14, you've got the idea that it is not the will of God that any one of these little ones should perish. So we should not neglect the little ones. And Jesus illustrates this with a parable. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So let us not neglect others. And again, we could apply that to our own children. Don't neglect the salvation of your children. We need to make time for the spiritual welfare of our children. You know, we say to them, have you done your homework? Thinking of school and putting a lot of emphasis upon education. Well, what about an emphasis upon spiritual things and being an example and a teacher and an encourager? And each one of us in the congregation doing what we can to again encourage the children, make them feel a part of the congregation. Because if we cold shoulder them, they're not going to want to stay around the church when they get older. And then again, with other Christian people who are Christians, what about them? You know, sometimes a member of the church stops attending, and the preacher goes and visits. The preacher tries to reach out to them. Maybe one or two others in the congregation do, but most of the congregation never call, never check. We should all be concerned, especially when a Christian stops attending. Why is it? What's the problem? How can we help? You see this sort of attitude over in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is still called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Exhort one another. In other words, urge one another to keep on the right path. You've got that idea also of encouraging one another in Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. So don't neglect one another. 3 times here in Matthew 18, Jesus talks about the little ones. Who's he referring to? I think it's both children and fellow Christians as well. We're the sort of people who should care about other people regardless of age. We're not islands. We shouldn't isolate ourselves from others, but rather we should recognize that each individual is our brother. And we need to do everything we can to help them. Do not corrupt the little ones by leading them into sin through our own negative influence. Do not despise little ones by treating them as though they don't matter, by ignoring them or frequently criticizing them. Do not neglect little ones. Give them time and attention. Encourage them. Help them. Cain asked the question, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. Philippians 2 and verse 4, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. I was within watching the coronation last night, one of the things that stood out to me in that regard was the emphasis upon the fact that the king was to be responsible for his subjects. He was there to serve. He was not there to take whatever he could from the people he was reigning over, but rather he was to serve as their monarch, helping them. And that's a principle I think that we should take note of with regard to ourselves. That we be people who serve, people who care for everyone around us, whether they're young, whether they're older. Don't neglect them, don't mislead them. Rather, do everything you can to help your fellow man. Let's stand and sing.